You tell me your electorate, and I'll tell you your position on this shutdown, right? And if your electorate, if it's an electorate where you're more worried about the general, the swing voter, you were probably on the side of figuring out how to do a pause in this shutdown. And if you were somebody who's got to worry more about a primary voter, then you were going to be emphatic against cutting this deal. And I think the reaction is a reminder that this was not about healthcare, right? This was about finally confronting Trump on something, right? And the Democratic Party hadn't done any decent confrontation, really. A few governors had in trying to fight back on National Guard efforts and things like that. But there hadn't been a real showdown between the party and Trump. And the shutdown provided that. And politically, in the last 40 days, it energized the base of the Democratic Party. And they felt good about that energy. And because the elections went well last week, it seemed to provide the confirmation, a sort of form of confirmation bias. Hey, this shutdown seems to be working. Look at how well our candidates did. Why give up this idea now when at the end of the day, things can turn quickly if you're not careful. And already some polling has surfaced about how as this shutdown was impacting more and more Americans, blame was starting to get shared more and more between both parties. Yes, Republicans were taking the brunt of the blame. Yes, Mike Johnson and Donald Trump were actually making it easier for Democrats to politically win the shutdown by their own maneuvers and their own decision making there. But ultimately, as I've stated in a few other places that I've spoken in the last 48 hours, there is a large chunk of voters in the middle who don't pay attention to day-to-day machinations, but that will pay attention when the proverbial government toilet is clogged, and not being able to travel around Thanksgiving at a time when we have almost no choice but to use the airplanes in order to get where we want to get in a short weekend, was a way that you were suddenly going to start impacting people that don't normally pay attention to the day-to-day machinations. And that actually can become long-term more politically damaging than anything you think is going for you in the short term. So that's my basic way to explain the situation we're in. Now, what's funny here is leave it to the Democrats to come across as, they're essentially divided over tactics. They're not divided over any issue. They all believe in this healthcare issue. They all believe Trump needs to be confronted. They all believe they've got to shift their messaging to cost of living issues, right? So this is a party that is fighting over tactics. Do they have the right leaders? They probably don't. Does changing leaders change the debate on tactics? I don't know if it really does. But I will say this, once you have lost the trust of the people you're trying to lead, you probably ought to leave, right? And the best thing for the party would be if Chuck Schumer went out on his own, not forcing more groups to come out calling for his resignation and all this stuff. But ultimately, I don't know if it changes. You're still going to have a leader that's got to be thinking about, hey, the base wants one thing, but you still got to appeal to swing voters if you actually want to win enough seats to actually be in charge of governing something. So I think that tension would exist whether it was Schumer, whether Brian Schatz is there, whether it's Chris Murphy, whether it's Amy Klobuchar, whether it's Patty Murray, right? We could come up, and I think if, this is one of those moments where if Schumer just decided in the next week to sort of, you know what, all right, I'm not wanted here, I'll take a step back. My gut is Patty Murray would replace him because she'd be seen as a quote unquote caretaker majority leader. She's at this point the senior most member of the Democratic Senate, and nobody would cross her, right? And she really has the respect of sort of all wings of the party. I think she'd be seen, the original mom in tennis shoes, as she ran as sort of a populist candidate of her day in 1992 when she first came on the national scene. I think she would be seen as somebody that would be less of a public face for the party, and in some ways, I think many senators wouldn't mind that and would likely embrace that. But let's be realistic. You may not see any change in the short term. To me, while it's easy to cover this tactical split inside the Democratic Party because it's sort of easy to do. It's easy to create a cable news segment on it. It's easy to find people to criticize. It's sort of an easy debate to have. It's not really that big of a divide because it's not over some sort of fundamental ideological disagreement, where, for instance, like things with Mamdani, those are fundamental ideological disagreements about, how involved government should be in the economy. That's a larger divide that I think doesn't really get dealt with in the Democratic Party until the presidential primaries take shape. But I tell you, even as everybody's focused on the Dem divide here, don't take your eye off the ball of a growing Republican divide. I think that is coming. I think that right now, if you're a Republican elected official in Congress, you're trying to figure out, what do I do when the leader of the party is not accepting reality? And Donald Trump's inability to accept the reality that this economy sucks for a lot of his supporters is going to cause a much bigger problem for the Republican Party than anything the Democratic Party is going through at the moment. Because ultimately, because they're in the minority and because they're in the opposition, they're going to have a unity of message. They're going to have a unity of focus. They may disagree on how to deal with Trump in the moment, but they're not going to disagree on how to court the voters in 2026. That's a divide that I think that is not the case on the Republican side of the aisle. As this economy weakens for those without money, and essentially with those without real savings, and that's what we're seeing here, right? This is the very definition of a trickle-down economy, where Donald Trump is hoping that the stock market success is going to somehow trickle down and help everybody else. There's not a lot of evidence that ever works. You can just go back 100 years and see how that worked out the last time we sort of tried to put together an economy where government and big business fused itself together, like it did in the early parts of the industrial age. That didn't end well. We got a Great Depression, and then finally the people decided, hey, they wanted government. They wanted more guardrails on big business, more guardrails on the economy than what we had at the time. And I have a feeling we're going to end up in a similar situation where we're going to have a downturn caused by what we're seeing, this fusion of big tech and government, and that is going to awaken a bunch of people who are going to want more guardrails put on our economy, not necessarily leaving capitalism, but something more akin to what the two Roosevelts fought for, both Teddy and Franklin. In their very different ways. Do you hate hangovers? Well, say goodbye to hangovers. Out of Office gives you the social buzz without the next day regret. Their best-selling Out of Office gummies were designed to provide a mild, relaxing buzz, boost your mood, and enhance creativity and relaxation. With 5 different strengths, you can tailor the dose to fit your vibe. From a gentle 1.5 milligram micro dose to their newest 15 milligram gummy for a more elevated experience. Their THC beverages and gummies are a modern, mindful alternative to a glass of wine or a cocktail. And I'll tell you this, I've given up booze. I don't like the hangovers. I prefer the gummy experience. Soul is a wellness brand that believes feeling good should be fun and easy. Soul specializes in delicious hemp-derived THC and CBD products, all designed to boost your mood and simply help you unwind. And if you struggle to switch off at night, Soul has a variety of products specifically designed to help you get a better night's rest, including their top-selling Sleepy Gummies. It's a fan favorite for deep, restorative sleep. So bring on the good vibes and treat yourself to Soul today. Right now, Soul is offering my audience 30% off your entire order. So go to getsoul.com, use the promo code ToddCast. Don't forget that code. That's getsoul.com, promo code ToddCast for 30% off. I did get a lot of questions on the shutdown, so I decided that before we get to the interview that I would answer all the shutdown-related Q&As. So we'll begin with this. This comes from Tim, and he asks, I don't understand why the Democrats are being blamed for the shutdown. If the Speaker will not convene the House, how can the Dems vote against it? Also, if the Republicans control the House, why can't they just vote to pass it? I think too many too many times reporters assume that people know the most basic facts about an issue, or maybe this was reported at the beginning of the shutdown, so they don't need to reiterate those facts. I think it is helpful to remind people periodically of those basic facts. Thanks, Tim. Tim, you're absolutely right. This is a pet peeve of mine. I talk about this to new journalists or those folks in journalism school, where I remind people, because I learned this from interacting with viewers during my time at Meet the Press, is how often a viewer, particularly a first-generation American, would come up to me and say that they watch Meet the Press to sort of understand how the American government works. And every time I would get a response like that, it would remind me that, hey, we're in the education business first, right? That's first and foremost what a journalist is. They're educating the public. And we shouldn't forget that. And I had a viewer one time say, I think it was somebody on social media, one time respond, when somebody was lamenting the fact that people didn't know that there were 9 members of the Supreme Court or how all that worked. Somebody said, how often do you put it in your stories? And I thought, that person's right. We sometimes don't reiterate basic facts about government because we go through this. Well, people already know that, or the people that are paying attention to this story are already going to know those things. And you're like, well, what about the Joe DiMaggio? There was a great saying by Joe DiMaggio. He used to say he played hard every game because he thought that there might be somebody in the stands who was coming to see him for the very first time. And guess what? There's somebody reading your story. There's somebody listening to my podcast. There's somebody, reading your commentary for the very first time. And if they don't understand it, they're not going to read you again, right? Or they may not be as they may not follow the topic you're trying to get them to follow because you didn't help them understand how it works. So I believe in this. I look at my college football writers. They spend a lot of time explaining how the college football playoff works. So college football fans all know how the college football playoff works, but it's not because they went out to look for it. It's because the news stories and the news commentators, and ESPN in particular, constantly wants to remind people how it works. Now they have an incentive. They're trying to make a bigger deal out of it. Well, we ought to take that same premise there. So you're asking, why did the Democrats why should the Democrats get blamed for the shutdown? Well, it was technically Democrats that withheld just enough votes where the continuing resolution to keep the government open couldn't pass the Senate. Now, in the House, Mike Johnson got a party line vote and he passed the continuing resolution in the House. So what they did is he passed that bill, and then this is a case where the House wanted to jam the Senate, and they didn't want to. And his thesis was, I'm not going to convene the House until the Senate deals with the bill that we gave them. And we gave them a bill to keep the government open. It's up to them to get that bill passed. So this is the House passed its version. So no, you're right. The House didn't convene while the government was shut down. But what Johnson's thesis was, they didn't need to because there was no legislation. Now, why else did he keep them out? Well, because he didn't want his members, bored, showing up on cable TV, saying things that would cause them political pain, et cetera, et cetera. But it was also a tactic, and this is something that happens. There's always a joke in Congress that, that the real divide in Congress is not Democrats versus Republicans, it's the House versus the Senate. And so, the House was essentially jamming the Senate and jamming John Thune. So it was up to John Thune, who had 53 Republican senators, actually 52, because Rand Paul indicated he was going to vote against this deal. He had to go find 8 Democrats. So in that sense, this is why, in theory, because it needed 60 votes, when Democrats withheld their votes, unless the Republicans are willing to get rid of the filibuster, which was something Donald Trump talked about, then the only way the government could get reopened is if 8 Democrats joined 52 Republicans to reopen the government. So I think what you're right about is every time that the story was reported, that would not be explained at the top. And I think it's a bad habit. Professional journalists, particularly Washington journalists, have come. I always say that a lot of times Washington reports for Washington, or producers produce segments for producers. They don't think about sort of, are we educating somebody who's tuning in for the very first time? And In that sense, I think that's something that we all need to do better on. And that's why I love the podcast format, where I can feel like I don't have some sort of time constraint where I have to take a shortcut on something because the main thing I need to convey needs a certain amount of time to explain. And I don't want to take away from that by having to explain the basics. And yet, not explaining the basics all the time is what makes politics inaccessible to people. And I've always said my real goal, and I've had this goal ever since I entered journalism, and political journalism, is I love politics. And my job is to explain it in such a way that it's more accessible to people. There was another person who used to go out of his way to talk about the Gang of 500 and made politics inaccessible and would claim that politics was an exclusive club and only those in the know understood it. Yeah, there's people that want politics to be that way. So that way they are not subject to what the actual democracy wants, small d democracy wants. And so in that sense, I'm a populist when it comes to information. And I think we need to make politics more accessible, more understandable, so more people understand how much it's impacting their lives. I hope that helped you as to understand why, in this case, Democrats had skin in the game here. I hope that helped him. All right, next question comes from Brian in New England, and he writes, so I can't help but notice all of the liberal political commentators seem to think they have lost the shutdown fight. Likewise, all of the conservative political commentators believe they somehow won the shutdown fight, assuming no last-minute silliness by Senator Rand Paul. Yet all of the more moderate political commentators seem to paint a vastly different picture as to who won and lost, and most seem to think Democrats got most out of the shutdown. So this brings up a good question. How do you win a shutdown fight? How do you know who won the shutdown fight? Can you even win a shutdown fight? Or is it really just a lose, lose, lose for everyone involved? Or at the end of the day, is who won or lost a shutdown all just vibes and fuzzy feelings anyway? To me, it kind of feels like the old "Whose Line Is It Anyway" TV show. Everything is made up and the points don't seem to matter. Well, look, this is, if you really want to wind me up, the entire shutdown process is a manufactured political circus. The idea that the most important government on the face of the earth has a bug in it that allows for parts of the government to just simply shut down when there is a political dispute over funding levels is got to be one of the dumber things anybody does. The idea that, I just think that the legal interpretations, and I went through this for those of you that wanted to go off, I am, but let me just tell you, I am furious that there is not a single effing member of Congress in the Senate or the House that is rallying around the idea that we need to prevent shutdowns from ever happening again. It is absurd that we are hiring people to be air traffic controllers. And part of the process is, hey, every couple of years, there's going to be a political fight and you're not going to get paid for about a month or two. Are you okay with that? What kind of circus are we running here? I mean, that's just, deciding to intentionally create a shit show government. It's stupid. It's unnecessary, and it shouldn't be. It's dumb. The only people that benefit from a shutdown are elected officials who are trying to make a name for themselves. You ask who wins in a shutdown? Individuals win. No party wins. Nobody likes the result of the shutdown at the end of the day. Everybody collectively hates the process of it, right? But the winners are individuals. Ted Cruz, so take the 2013 shutdown. Republicans, quote unquote, are seen as having lost that shutdown, right? Because politically they did. If it wasn't for the shutdown, Republicans would have won a governor's seat in Virginia that year, and instead Democrats won the governor's seat. So you could look at just sort of the tactics and say, Republicans lost. And Ted Cruz was unfavorable. Yet Ted Cruz built a political following. Ted Cruz was trying to run for president in 2016 and build a national following. So it worked for Ted Cruz. And that's who these shutdowns are for. They're for partisan actors, pure and simple, to try to make a name for themselves. That's so the only people that have ever come out, quote unquote, ahead. Right? It becomes about who can raise the most money off of the the silliness of the shutdown. And I'm sorry. I just think the idea that it's a practice that is somehow allowed, and the only reason to have it is to figure out a way to bring more attention to a funding dispute. Guess what? Um, Perhaps we shouldn't put 350 million people in the crosshairs of a political disagreement over funding levels. That seems like a waste of a superpower's time. It actually makes us more vulnerable as a nation on national security. It is certainly a huge sign of weakness. And again, so a responsible democracy and a responsible government wouldn't put us in a situation where we can just easily have a couple of people decide that the government is just going to close its doors. And then, of course, we've exempted so many aspects of the shutdown that if the initial idea of the shutdown was to, it was going to be so painful that everybody wouldn't want it to be for more than a day or two. But when you take away, when you decide, well, Social Security isn't going to be a part of it, and we'll exempt military pay, and we'll exempt this, and we'll exempt that, then it becomes easier to do the political theater. So I have to say, as a voter who would like to have less dysfunction in our politics, am sorry that there's not a single elected member of Congress, Democrat or Republican, currently advocating a no shutdowns bill. They've existed in the past. Where are they now? Where are they today? Instead, everybody wants to perform for the frickin' bases of each party because of how stupidly we've gerrymandered everything and our partisan primaries, all of those things, right? We have all of our incentive structures are for politicians to only pay attention to the base. And it's just so the people that hate this shutdown stuff the most are the ones that aren't partisan activists. And it doesn't seem like there's a single person in Congress that represents the constituency that just doesn't want the goddamn toilet clogged purposely. And instead, this is what we have. So I don't know if that answered your question, Brian. I don't think anybody won the shutdown fight. And if you're wondering, to me, it is one of those where the only time anybody gains from it is if they're trying to if it's somebody individually trying to build their own following for some sort of national political purpose. And the best example of that, Ted Cruz 2013. A shutdown that was seen as a loser, but actually gave Ted Cruz a constituency. This episode of the Chuck ToddCast is brought to you by Wild Grain. Wild Grain is the first bake from frozen subscription box for artisanal breads, seasonal pastries, and fresh pastas. Plus, all items conveniently bake in 25 minutes or less. Unlike many store-bought options, Wild Grain uses simple ingredients you can pronounce and a slow fermentation process that can be easier on your belly and richer in nutrients and antioxidants. Wild Grain's boxes are fully customizable. They're constantly adding seasonal and limited time products for you to enjoy. In addition to their classic box, they now feature a gluten-free box and a plant-based box. I checked out the gluten-free box, and let me tell you, they have a gluten-free sourdough bread. We got 2 loaves of it, and we've done 1 loaf already. It's a cranberry and almond sourdough bread. It's like the best raisin bread you've ever had, except it's not raisins. It's hit or miss if you mess around in the gluten-free bread world. This is a hit. This is well done. It's not heavy. It doesn't feel like a rock. Anyway, I was impressed. So look, for a limited time, Wild Grain is offering our listeners $30 off your first box, plus free croissants in every box when you go to wildgrain.com/Toddcast to start your subscription. $30 off your first box when you go to wildgrain.com/Toddcast. That's wildgrain.com/Toddcast, or simply use the promo code Toddcast at checkout. Always use the code, get the discount. I'm telling you, it's excellent, Excellent, Brett. All right. Next question comes from Kenny from Long Island. And he writes, my question for you is about the deal that seems to have been struck. It seems to me that the Democrats traded their leverage for a campaign ad. The Republicans will now have to take the tough vote, but will inevitably vote down the Obamacare subsidies, and that's about it. SNAP resumes, payments resume, no one gets fired, but all that is the standard course of events for the end of a shutdown. The only thing Senator Schumer seems to have extracted here is a tough vote. Am I reading this correctly? If so, why on earth would he have fought this hard and held out this long only to give up and walk away with nothing to show for it? Lastly, I agree and disagree with your assessment about President Trump entering this lame duck era. I agree that's the big takeaway for the shutdown resolution. To me, though, it's not because of the defiance. It's because they negotiated a solution without him, in the Senate at least. The president disengaged and made it easy for this to play out, but ultimately Senator Thune struck the deal. I love the new format, and I feel as though I'm learning so much more about the inside game when it comes to politics. Thank you for the scoop. All right. Kenny, I appreciate the constructive critique there on that front. It's interesting. I guess I could word it, and again, I would word it differently. I don't think there's a cave here. I think Warnock said it. He said, if you're going to say that the Democratic Party seems to care about those on SNAP benefits more than the Republican Party cares about, then I think he said guilty as charged, right? That's not and I think if you're, again, a better leader and a better communicator would not have signaled that this is over. It would signal that, I think we've gotten more people aware of this healthcare issue. We're sorry that the president wants to irresponsibly punish people that have nothing and weaponize the FAA and all of this. And so we're not going to let him do that. So we're going to take a pause in this over the next 2 months. We're going to make sure people can travel for the holidays. And come January, there's another vote to reopen the government and there's Obamacare subsidies. Okay. So I don't think they gave away any leverage. I think they still have leverage in January to essentially shut down government again if they want to, if these Obamacare subsidies don't get passed for a year. I think that there's going to be a majority of the U.S. House that votes for these Obamacare subsidies, not a majority of Republicans, but a majority of the House. I think you will see somewhere between 30 and 40 Republicans who do this. I think you will see 10 to 15 Senate Republicans wanting to be for this. So I think it's going to happen. I think the results of I think the biggest impact on the healthcare subsidies was the 2025 election results. The fact that it was a romp, the fact that cost of living issues, and Democrats didn't even have the healthcare issue yet, and it was working for them. We already know how well healthcare works as an opposition issue when you're messing with it. We just saw it in 2018 that benefited the Democrats, and back in 2010 when it benefited the Republicans. Anytime you mess with the status quo of healthcare, the party messing with the status quo gets punished. And in this case, that's going to be now the Republicans. And so I guess I don't accept the premise that they got rid of any of their leverage. And I think this is why I could argue this is why Schumer should go, because he's a terrible communicator and he couldn't communicate that they won. They won. If you want to, and he's trying now, but he just doesn't have credibility with anybody anymore, right? It's like I said, I keep comparing Schumer to Pete Carroll and Bill Belichick. They used to have credibility with the players they coached. Now they don't anymore. That happens. It happens in every walk of life. It happens to political leaders all the time. There's a moment when they have uber leverage over the entire party, and there's moments where nobody will listen to them. George W. Bush had so much influence over his party for a period of time until he had no influence over his party for a period of time, right? Political capital is elusive. When you have it, you better spend it, because if you try to save it, it'll disappear. I guess I think they could have communicated this in such a way where they could have been seen as the adult in the room and not giving up their fight on healthcare, because technically they've given themselves opportunities before the State of the Union in February to make this a showdown vote one more time. All right. Last question comes from David Crowder. Uh, and then we'll get to the interview with Joe Willett. I like your work and thoughtfulness. Thank you. Saw your podcast this AM. First, Info and Jay Jones came out in mid-October. Virginia begins early voting mid-September. You get my point. Second, the shutdown argument. Pre-pandemic, some 12 million participated in the bill. Their subsidies remain with premium increases. It's not a big deal. The big deal is the 12 million who enrolled post-pandemic, who did not qualify financially for pre-pandemic for subsidies. They lose the subsidies. Is that disconnect worth shutting down the government? I don't know. Seems like some form of a subsidy could be agreed upon. Finally, the tax breaks that were scheduled to expire were extended. The difference is the subsidies weren't scheduled to expire. It's all crap. David, you've summarized the poor legislative process quite well, right? You know, the fact that we have such a dysfunctional way that we make laws now, and we have such distrust of the two parties that there's always a weird poison pills in different ways, right? The subsidies, they can't, did Democrats want those subsidies in perpetuity? They did. Could they not get enough votes to get them without putting some sort of timestamp on it? They couldn't. Ditto with the tax cut, right? They couldn't. Trump couldn't get it permanent, so instead he had an expiration date on it, hoping that the expiration would serve as a fear of a tax hike, and then that somehow would get people to renew them. The Bush tax cuts work this way, right? These 10-year increments, we do this sort of funny business accounting when it comes to the impact on the deficit with these funny numbers with the Congressional Budget Office and these estimates that are all just sort of make assumptions that nobody can assume when it comes to the actual state of the economy. But we make these deficit projections in such a way that it encourages these sort of false expiration dates, right? Some will have them, some will don't. They're usually timed to make it politically difficult to somehow not extend the deadline, whether it's on a tax rate or whether it's on a subsidy or whatever it is. So, this goes to this is what you get when you don't have a functioning committee process in Congress. And not to get really dorky here, but essentially when we totally polarized the U.S. House, which really began sort of late 80s, early 90s, right? And there's those on the right blame Jim Wright and the Democrats. Those on the left blame Newt Gingrich and the Republicans. I think sort of there was certainly power plays that Jim Wright made that Newt Gingrich then emulated and took even further, that ultimately destroyed the committee process. And the destruction of the congressional committee process, both in the House and the Senate, is why we get such poorly written legislation, which you so, I think, eloquently pointed out with the way you worded your question. The fact that the question was a bit confusing, I don't put on you, I put on Congress, because this is how they legislate now, with these sort of weird expiration dates. That's all designed to create sort of political poison. It's almost like these sort of delayed bombs that suddenly explode, and you have no choice but to continue a policy that maybe you were never in favor of. Obama ran on getting rid of the Bush tax cuts. Turns out he couldn't get rid of them because of what kind of impact it would have had on a number of people seeing their tax bills go up, and he didn't want to politically put himself in that situation. He had made a pledge not to raise taxes on anybody over, I think it was $400,000. So that's the new line that they drew on that. So ultimately, someday we're going to have a Speaker of the House and a Senate Majority Leader that actually wants to make the legislative branch great again. But until that time comes, we're going to continue to have this poor, horribly dysfunctional legislative process that we've now seen, that for many of you feels like the normal way Congress works. Because trust me, this was not the intent. How Congress has worked the last 30 years is not the way that Congress was intended to work in the previous 220 years.
There's a reason results matter more than promises. Just like there's a reason Morgan & Morgan has become America's largest injury law firm. For the last 35 years, they've recovered $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. It includes cases where insurance companies offered next to nothing, short of shortchanging, seeing if they could get away with it. And Morgan & Morgan fought back, and they won millions. In Pennsylvania, one client was awarded $26 million. It was a staggering 40 times the amount that the insurance company originally offered. That offer, $650,000, whatever it took to sort of get away without paying. So with more than 1,000 lawyers across the country, Morgan & Morgan knows how to deliver for everyday people. So if you're injured, you're looking for a lawyer, check out forthepeople.com/Toddcast or dial pound law, pound 529 on your cell phone. And remember, all law firms are not the same. So give Morgan & Morgan a look. Their fee is free unless they win.